Okay.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for agreeing to do this interview. So, for my sake, for everybody's sake, could you briefly introduce yourself, your personal background, your academic background, and your professional background?
Okay, so thanks very much, John, for inviting me for this. It's really exciting. And okay, so I'm Aysin Kadirbeyoglu. I am a legal counsel. I'm a legal manager in Karadeniz Holding, which is a Turkey-based international energy company that specializes on mobile energy solutions and operates around the world. So I've been working with this company for 5 years, and my specialization is international business transactions focused in the energy sector. And I've been doing international business transactions, M&As, commercial contracts, energy purchase contracts, and international arbitration as it is required during various projects. Before that, I had different roles in different jurisdictions, including European Bank for uh, Reconstruction and Development, and Three Crowns, which is an arbitration firm in London. I've worked for worked as a remote associate in Sterlington Legal for some time, and before that, I was a junior associate in Dentons Istanbul. Um, I studied and graduated from Istanbul University for my bachelor's, and afterwards I went to New York at New York University to complete my LL.M. In International Business Transactions and Arbitration. So basically, that is my professional and academical background, and I've been in international law for more than 8 years, I would say.
Okay. So, if we take a step back to the very start of your journey,
Yeah.
why did you choose to study the law in college? I mean, you were an 18-year-old, you could have chosen anything. What made you say, you know what, I'm going to dedicate my life to the law?
That's my grandfather, who
Mhm.
was a lawyer, and my father was a lawyer, and I grew up, looking up to them, going into their office since I was a baby, looking
Mhm.
up to all those books, and I was always a bit of a bookworm myself, so I thought like reading and writing and arguing and not only the sense of arguing, but also working on arguments and, like drafting, those types of things fascinated me a lot. And that's how I sort of wanted to be in the legal world from the very beginning, I would say.
Mhm. And then, I mean, the legal world is quite large. It's got segments of different countries, and there's a Turkish legal world and an American one. So, what was the sort of impetus for you to take that step outside of Turkey? I mean, why study in the US? Why not, stay in Turkey, or why not study in Kenya? What was that sort of decision for you?
Yeah, that had two steps, I would say. First of all, because of my academical background and my high school, I went to an American high school, and we sort of were always surrounded by the American academical influence. And most of my friends were pursuing a career in the, I mean, not career, but they wanted to pursue a career in the US, so they wanted to apply to US schools. And I sort of wanted to be in that academical atmosphere. I always found myself fit in that atmosphere. However, I knew I wanted to study law and I wanted to practice with my father and grandfather. That sort of required me to remain local at the same time. So at that time, I thought, I mean, the decision that seemed logical to me was to do my bachelor degree in Turkey, study law in Turkey. But I always remained passionate about uh, you know, extending my expertise and extending my knowledge in an international sphere. And that's how doing my master's degree in the US came into the portrait. Also, when you sort of like grow up and then you go into the expertise of your family, first you look up to them and then you start doing the same things with them. And then you see that they know everything better than you. So you always have to keep up with them. So I thought what I need to do is to step up my game, right? I need to know something else. I need to do something new. I need to do something international and then grow the business in a more new and more foreign nature than they did. And that also was the second reason why I always wanted to sort of put another layer, an international layer to my studies and for my, I don't know, for my expertise, let's say.
And how was that sort of stepping up your game for you? Was it a, difficult adjustment to go from a Turkish legal education to then a master's in the US? Do you think your sort of high school background helped you with that transition? How would you sort of reflect on that looking back now?
I mean, I would say if I directly went from high school to a US school first and then to law school, that would be much more helpful than going first to law school in Turkey and
Mhm.
then go back to, I mean, no, going to the US for legal studies, but in a complete different manner. Because the
Mhm.
civil law and common law, two different things, two different ways of education. So I had to first unlearn some of the things that I've learned in law school and then try to first learn a learning method and
Mhm.
then adapt to it and then actually learn the contents of it. But once you actually adapt to learning something and learn the methods of learning, I think it's much more easier and it's more required than actually learning the content because especially in the times that we live in, the content is available everywhere, but you have to sort of learn which methods to use for learning and for educating yourself and knowing where to look for that information. And I think in that sense, it was super useful to know the common law methods while knowing the civil law methods at the same time.
So to sort of circle around what you just said, what are the sort of, learning methods that are result of the different common civil law systems? I mean, what sort of different approaches were necessary under a civil law system in Turkey versus a common law system in the US that you had to sort of adapt to? I want to get a definition of what you mean by
Yeah,
different learning methods.
so I don't know if I can give an exact definition of that, but for example, uh, unlearning the codes and sticking to the codes, and then trying to learn that law is sort of like a living mechanism through the common law system, through the precedents, and learning that you don't have specific sort of code like um, how do you say the code like formulas that you
Mhm.
can grasp, you can learn and apply to every situation, but rather you have these examples where you read and where you think about, and then when you are faced with a similar situation, how do you interpret those? So interpretation becomes sort of like your first tool instead of going into, okay, where I can find the solution, where I can find a formula for this.
Mhm.
So that's sort of like the main difference between the education, main difference between the legal systems. And I think it also influences the way of thinking and the way of education as well. Because, sometimes like you go to the school in Turkey and then you learn about the subjects in an order, and then that order generally either follows law or follows the systems, and then you get references to the code. So you need to know the answer when you go into an exam. It's almost always closed book, and you have to know the contents because they're the law. Whereas in the US, you have to learn the thinking method. You have to learn how to get there. You have to know how to interpret and how to originally interpret something. And actually, I think that speaks in general for the US education system, because that was generally what we were taught in high school as well, when we were, interpreting a poem, for example, or something that we read. It was always like, it was never what's the aim of this poem or what did Shakespeare actually meant to write, but it was always like, how did it speak to you and how do you see the reflection on something else? It's generally the comparison between something and something, and then understanding the logical sort of like root behind your thinking.
So as you sort of look back on that transition as well, I mean, did it sort of change how you thought at large with the sort of more critical, more how does it speak to me? How does not, what's the sort of answer to this mathematical problem? But perhaps how does this mathematical problem impact you? I don't know. It doesn't really work with math. But do you sort of think it changed you as a professional, as a lawyer, as someone in the legal field? And if so, how?
It did. It definitely did. First of all, like understanding there are different ways of thinking and there are different ways of approaching law is the first step that changes you. And it really helped me to become the legal counsel working in an international sphere that I am right now. So, for example, it's not only US law or English law or Turkish law that you are faced with. Sometimes you have to deal with some specific local laws which you have nothing about. You can only interpret them in the terms of like which law they resemble to. However, once you understand that, okay, this is a different law, how do I approach to that? Which law does it, does it come from? How do they do these things? Is it a codified law system? Is it a more like common law system? How can I get to the precedents? Like what? And engaging with some local council, for example, understanding the regulations and how does it work. So it sort of broadens your horizons in the sense that you know how the legal system works and you know how different legal systems may work. First, knowing that step, and it sort of gives you a stop from immediately thinking that this is the right way. There can be myriads of right ways, and you need to sort of like first understand and then interpret it with your legal sensibility. First, know where to look, who to speak with, and then, get familiarized with the local laws and then apply your legal understanding to their specific system. That was one thing that I took and that I use daily in my professional life.
So a lot of those, what you mentioned, and sort of knowing where to look, knowing how to speak to people, knowing who to speak to, are all sort of these soft skills of navigating perhaps the communication side of the legal practice. Of course, it's interpersonal. Law cannot really be, just one person contained. But do you think there were any sort of hard skills that were necessary in your development as well, particularly in legal writing, legal argumentation, in terms of speaking, in terms of presentation?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So, legal writing is essential in all of the law systems. That's what I think. So, in, you know, in Turkish legal system, you use a more, how to say, like an older language with like longer presentations, longer writing. You refer to like you sort of have a storyline, but you have to stick with the technical legal terms quite a lot. Whereas in the US legal system, what I found more interesting is that you are more concise. You tend to go for like shorter answers. You tend to go more to the truth of the case rather than like dwelling into the legal language.
Mm.
So it's sort of like the difference of where you get to. That was something that I learned and tried to sort of adapt in my use. And also the style of the legal people could change a lot. So, for example, the technical knowledge, like both Turkish lawyers and US lawyers have a lot of like technical legal knowledge and they stand out for that, but how they present it can sometimes differ. Like I tend to see that the US legal people and US lawyers are more like businessmen. So they have a way of like presenting legal facts with the more, it's adjusted to the realities of the transaction, realities of business, and realities of the daily work. But sometimes in the civil law systems, law can be seen something as separate from the rest of all the practitioners, and then it's more rigid and it must be rigidly applied. So being a in-house legal counsel made me see that like sometimes making that connection between law and how the law applies to business can be really very important, and that was one of the things that my US qualification sort of helped me out, helped me understand, like okay, I know this background, but I know this law, how it helps me get through this problem.
So, sort of asking the why on that. I mean, you say Turkish lawyers are perhaps more segmented into you stay on the legal side, you're not as integrated into the rest of the operations, versus in the US or in your occupation now, you're sort of a part of the team, you know? Perhaps they have other expertise, you're the one with the legal expertise, but you're all sort of part of the same team. Why do you sort of think that structural difference is? Is it just a result of the common civil law systems, or do you think it's a reflection of something cultural about the team as well?
Not necessarily. I do think it's a bit of a cultural difference because I don't see that much of like business oriented approach in the English qualified lawyers. They're more law oriented lawyers as the rest of the European countries. But with the US, I think one particular reason might be that you sort of have your pre university studies aside from law, and then you study law afterwards. It's still like that, right? It hasn't changed.
Yes.
So you sort of like before you go into law, I think it's similar with meds, right? So
Mhm.
you tend to either study economics or international relations or something else, and then it gives you a completely different perspective. You basically already finish a university and then you have some different expertise and maybe you have a different way of approaching life, and then on top of it, here comes legal. You are more of a senior person. You have already an educated way of thinking, and then you start approaching law with already a background, a professional, I mean, academic professional background, and it comes on top of it.
Mhm.
So you're not thrown into the legal sea right away, but you sort of like already have a life suit or something. And I think that helps you navigate yourself within the legal system and see that like how law can be helpful in other like um, realities of life, I would say.
So perhaps working off of that, one question that I would have is, this sort of difference, of course, creates a difference in the relationship between the lawyer and the people they work for in terms of how integrated they are into a team. Do you think there are also differences in sort of how lawyers communicate with themselves because of this? And
Mm.
perhaps, looking more broadly at the communication that lawyers have, the styles that they have, the way they conduct themselves, or even the way they view themselves. Do you think they sort of interact with each other or team members or clients even differently in the two systems that you've looked at?
You know what? I think it's a great question because, like, now that you asked me this question, it made me think about the legal team that I work in.
Mhm.
So, I work in a very like wide legal team where we are almost like 11, 12 lawyers who all come from like who are all super qualified but come from different backgrounds. For example, the Francophone background is very different than the US background. And you can see sometimes how our approaches to different matters differ. Sometimes you can see some of the civil law background lawyers could be more rigid in their answers, and they could be more like a legal stereotype in the sense that this is not allowed. These are the risks. These are not, if you do this, this can happen. Whereas, like, what I see from the US qualified lawyers is that all right, this doesn't seem like the ideal situation or ideal drafting. How I would revise this would be this. If you would do this, you would sort of mitigate this risk like that. So instead of saying, like, oh, you don't do this, this is illegal, it comes with more like practical solutions or softening it or reading in a way that it sort of complies with what you do or finding a way to actually make it work could be more easier from the practitioners that come from like common law systems or more US sort of type of background. Whereas with the civil law systems and sometimes lawyers that are coming strictly out of like civil law firm background, it can sometimes go like, you know, this is not allowed. The laws are not like, the laws are like this. This is not compliant. If you leave it like that, this will be sort of the risk. So this is some sort of like a difference that I see. In the end, I need to add that I also see that like level of respect in between the lawyers as well, which is that I really like. So in different of like where you come from or which background you choose to have, the lawyers that work together or the lawyers that work within a project, at least what I've seen from the workplaces that the places that I worked in, it's like the legal people always respect each other and respect their, the colleagues' legal point of view. And instead of going like, oh, this is not correct, we always sort of like, this could be one interpretation. This is another interpretation. Let's come together and discuss our interpretations and try to combine our understandings and come to a resolution. This is something that I really like because it can broaden your horizons as well. Sometimes you can be too liberal with your legal approach, and sometimes another colleague can be a little bit too conservative with their approach. And when you come together, sometimes it takes like 30 or 40 minutes to discuss about like one particular word, like what does this word allow me? But then in the end, what's important is to protect your client's benefits. And also, if you are not on the dispute side but more on the drafting side, to make sure that you have drafted in a way that in case of a dispute you would be protecting your client's side. Sometimes even a vague wording can be more beneficial for you because you know that you are not actually on the 100% protected side, so you keep it more vague. But for some of the other things, you would really want to avoid the vague language, but then you would want to make it like strictly protected and everything outlined. So understanding the client's needs and then understanding different approaches and obviously having that open communication and I mean, not being a snob is very important in all of the senses, and you can sometimes see with like I know like we can be approached like that as if lawyers can be like that, but if you can like break that barrier, I think it really helps the practice in general.
So I sort of want to clarify and perhaps follow up on two things that you said. First of all, on this idea of the respect between lawyers. Do you think that's sort of more of a universal thing that you've seen across the systems you've looked at? Or do you think there's perhaps a different amount or different style of respect in the sort of Turkish system that you've seen, in the American system you've seen, in the UK system you've seen? Because, you've sort of praised this more cosmopolitan, like people of different backgrounds coming together, people of different understandings coming together and respecting each other. And so do you find that to be an aspect of the current setting you're in, or do you find it to be a more universal sort of trend through the legal systems that you've navigated?
I think it's where I am at the moment, and the reason is that I am also surrounded by lawyers who come from very cosmopolitan backgrounds, and I think this helps a lot because going back to what I've said before, seeing that there can be a lot of different legal backgrounds, seeing that there can be different legal approaches makes you not question, but like not question what you know of, but to be more understanding, to be more open, and to be more welcoming of different approaches and different ways of legal thinking. So once you have that experience, I think you are more open to those differences. And then when they come together, it really works like a Voltron. But for example, sometimes, and it doesn't matter whether it's a US lawyer, whether it's an English lawyer, or whether it's a Turkish lawyer, you sometimes see like super experienced lawyers. They're great in their sectors, but they don't really have that like international network, or like they just stick to what they know. Obviously, it makes them invaluable for their sector and for their expertise. But when they come across with an opposing counsel who is from another background, sometimes you can see that both can be condescending to each other, and they can come off as, I know this, you don't know a thing. I know this and you don't know a thing. So it's like a conflict between the councils. So in order to avoid that, I think like having this global understanding, I think in all professions, is something that we can benefit from.
So that was sort of the second thing that I wanted to circle back on is that you mentioned a particular snobbishness that could come off, and it seems as though it might come from experience leading to an ego inflation, perhaps. But I would ask as well, in this sort of like self-perception aspect of being a lawyer, in terms of how you see yourself and your experience, how you see your own capabilities, do you see any trends in sort of people of different backgrounds, people of different educations, seeing themselves in particular ways? Or could you like categorize that in terms of Turkish lawyers see themselves as, lawyers that, work in the legal field, do this, do that, but they see their sort of cultural or societal role as this, versus you see yourself now with an American education as part of a team, but you also see these different aspects. I know it's sort of a more difficult question because it's a more cultural analysis, but in your experience, are there any sort of trends in how people of different backgrounds might view themselves and how that might impact their work?
Yeah, so I think lawyers are lawyers everywhere. So, I've met my grandfather, I met my father. So when they're in their legal, uh, you know, like personas, they have that massive ego, and it's very impressive, when you look at it from a non-legal eye, like you see that. But once you actually go into that, particular profession, once you like start to get experience, there's this, I think the junior lawyers also give the senior lawyers that sort of respect, which feeds into their egos as well. I mean, they're doing something massive. The experience there is so important for the legal, world. I think experience is important everywhere, but I think being a lawyer is like has that societal etiquette of importance as well. And I think like most of the lawyers also are conscious of that. But that's like independent of where they come from. US lawyers know that, UK lawyers know that. I think English lawyers are particularly so proud of being lawyers. That's what I would say. But this comes off like in a traditional manner, I would say, because like being a lawyer is yeah, being a lawyer is a very ancient profession. And since the ancient times, it has been a respected profession where, it always needed a degree, it always needed a qualification. And I think that's one of the reasons that, like, people who studied law and became lawyers or became like judges, they always were regarded with respect, and from generations to generation sort of started like a class of people, and I think that applies to some other professions as well. I don't see right now that legal profession would be like this in any different way of other profession because like everybody's choosing one profession and doing the same thing. And the more I do legal work in a more business-like manner, it makes me think that like we're not doing something that different. We're just like focusing on one aspect of it. But I sort of like when I look at it, when I look at my grandfather, when I look at my father, I sort of understand where they're sort of like that, that proud of that proudness comes from.
Mhm.
I think that that comes from that, and that comes independently from like which legal system they studied in or
Mhm.
qualified
Okay. So, having looked back on the history of law as well as an ancient tradition, perhaps we should look forward a little bit in terms of, what you see your own path through the legal profession to be in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And perhaps not even looking at a roadmap, but what do you sort of hope to contribute to this profession? I mean, in terms of what you bring to the table to particular clients or to the profession at large, in terms of understanding, in terms of you being a global lawyer, having so much, experience in different countries. What do you sort of hope to contribute? What areas do you hope to, make some change in? Is there anything that comes to your mind?
Well, I mean, maybe that could be a longer step for me to do right now, but I always see myself like as a senior lawyer, let's say, maybe in 10 years, 15 years, to contribute to the women's rights and doing more pro bono work and maybe solely pro bono work to support to support people who need support and legal aid, especially in terms of like domestic violence, especially children's rights of like families coming from domestic violence and helping out. I mean, not criminals per se, but people who had the unfortunate, lives and then, helping out to their families. Like that's something where I want to see myself at. Right now, I know that what I'm doing is totally different than what I want to do, but I think like having that legal, education is, I mean, it will take me to where I want to be. And after like, you know, maybe having that whole experience, working in the companies, working at a global scope, like, having this experience like combined, um, I could sort of like, and especially like after the economical, concerns being in the background, like I would just like dedicate my life to going back to touching the people, touching the lives of like individual people, because that's something that I miss from my current uh profession, as I would say. Because I mean, right now it's so beautiful to see different jurisdictions, different big projects where they have an impact on, nations, and it has an impact on different countries, and then it has an impact on energy transition as a whole. But then sometimes I have hard times in seeing the individual impacts. So I think that would sort of like complement the whole legal experience that I would have in my life. And I think like that would a sort of like interpersonal experience for me could be better to me, like as a person and with my own, like for my own personal reasons as well.
All right. So as we sort of wrap up, I want to get some reflections from you on your sort of legal career. And the first thing that I would ask is, you have this past experience, where you're currently at, and you have these different ideas of what you could move forward into. If someone were to listen to your story and if they were to be inspired, if they were to want a young Turkish lawyer, if they wanted to go study abroad, if they wanted to pursue a career abroad, what sort of, strategies would you have for them? What sort of recommendations would you have? What sort of stories would you share to say, well, I face these challenges, you should learn from them and avoid these? What sort of, if I were, for example, a young Turkish lawyer, if you were speaking to one, what sort of things would you say to them?
Yeah. That's a good question because like I think a lot of lawyers would have a lot of like advice to give to younger lawyers because like we feel like we're constantly facing challenges and then learning from them, but we say like, oh, if I would go back, I would change this, I would change that, but you never have the chance to actually go back, right? So first of all, I would like I could probably do the same things all over again, but what I would advise to a young lawyer, and I know it's not an easy thing to do, is just when they're doing something, when they're applying for a college, when they're applying um, for a law certificate, when they're applying for a school, don't apply because everybody else is doing it. Don't apply because you think that you are falling behind. Don't apply to US because you think that like the US schools are the top schools. Like try to think about where you see yourself and what would make you happy. Because like sometimes what gets neglected is that, oh, I went to this school, I got an LL.M, I got the highest grades, and now I'm working in a top law firm, but then I don't get to live my life because I work until like 11 p.m. and that doesn't make me happy because I'm always like by the laptop and doing this job. So like there are also different types of millions of different types of jobs that you can do as a lawyer as well. And then success doesn't come from one particular road. Success comes from what makes you happy. And when you are happy and when you are content and when you're satisfied with what you do, it would it would only ever take you to success and be more successful at what you do. So my advice would be to, for example, if I would go back and advise myself, I would say, Aysin, would you be happy living in the US? Why do you want to study in the US? Maybe if I would know that I would be happier in London, I would come and study in London. I don't know. Or maybe I would just like take 1 year to learn another language because it would be more useful for my studies and for the international path that I would want to walk in, right? So there are different ways of approaching to success and to be the person you would want to be. So I would advise to think about those in a more broader aspect and not only from one aspect that would take you to this immediate understanding of success. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's something that I would do. You know, learn a lot of languages, take some time to experience the world, meet a lot of different people. Don't meet for the purpose of doing networking, but to make, to connect with people for genuine relationships. And genuine relationships would help you out, help you live a healthier life, longer life, and I think more satisfied life. And you would never know how it would play out in the end. Like most of the times, you get like more opportunities from the people who you can connect with from a more real perspective, I would say, and not only for professional perspectives. So that's one thing that, yeah, I would do. So spend more time with what you think you would excite you the most and try to invest in that more.
I think that's a pretty perfect recommendation. And,
Yeah.
as we sort of wrap up with everything, I do want to ask, because I do like asking this, in terms of if you look back on your journey and then look back on this conversation in the last 35, 40 minutes, what would be the sort of one thing you would like to highlight if someone were to just view these last 20 seconds or these last 30 seconds? What would be the one message that you want as a takeaway from what you've said, but not just that, from what you've experienced in the last, odd number of years of your life? What's the most important part of it?
I would say, be open to new opportunities and then don't be afraid to take that extra step, even if you're afraid of taking it, even if you're afraid of getting out of your comfort zone, because, life generally happens in a very different way that you have actually planned it. It's super good to be planned and it's super good to be prepared for anything that will come. But I would say be courageous enough to take those opportunities to go in different ways and take some detours along the way. Don't be afraid of losing time. Take that extra year, learn that extra language, take that additional vacation with your friends, because those are generally the moments that you carry with you. And then sometimes I mean, I do that mistake a lot. I sometimes feel like I have a lot of work. I cannot, like have time for this. But in the end, I look back at my life, and those are the times that I cherish the most. And those are the times that make my work meaningful, make my life meaningful, and that gives me the energy to put into my work and do some more quality work. So that's something that I would say, I would highlight.
Yeah. Um, I think on that note, thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you for participating in this interview. I think all your recommendations and all your experiences were wonderful to hear about.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, thank you so much.
Hopefully they will be helpful to someone. Yeah.
I have no doubt in my mind that they will be. Yeah.
Okay, let me know how it goes, John, and let me know if you have any additional questions and anything you would want me to clarify or whatever once you have that editing section. I know I can go from one place to another when I'm speaking, so just, don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything further.
Yeah. Of course. And with that, I'm just going to quickly end the recording.